In 1883, two of the richest families in America went to war. They did not fight with weapons. They fought with marble, gold leaf, and chandeliers the size of carriages. On one side stood the Astors. Their fortune came from fur pelts and Manhattan real estate. They had ruled New York society for half a century. On the other side stood the Vanderbilts. Their money came from steamships and railroads. They had more wealth than the Astors ever dreamed of. But wealth alone could not buy what they wanted most: acceptance. The Astors controlled who mattered in New York. They decided who received invitations and who was ignored. For years, they dismissed the Vanderbilts as vulgar newcomers, unworthy of polite company. The Vanderbilts refused to accept that verdict. What followed was a decades-long battle fought on Fifth Avenue, in Newport, and inside the gilded boxes of rival opera houses. The mansions that rose from this conflict became the most spectacular America had ever seen. Not because these families needed places to live, but because they needed to prove something. The buildings still stand today as monuments to ambition, rivalry, and the desperate hunger for status. To understand this rivalry, we need to start with the Astors. That means going back to the 1700s, to a young man who left Germany with almost nothing in his pocket. Chapter 1. The Fur Trader from Germany. Johann Jakob Astor was born in 1763 in the village of Waldorf, near Heidelberg. His father was a butcher. The family had little money and few prospects. By the time Johann was 17, he had already left home, determined to find something better. He walked to the Rhine River and worked his way down on a timber barge. His destination was London, where his older brother, George, had started a business making musical instruments. Johann spent 4 years there, learning English and saving every penny he earned. But England was not his final stop. Across the Atlantic, a new nation had just won its independence. Johann believed that America offered opportunities that Europe could not match. In 1783, he boarded a ship bound for the United States. He carried almost nothing. A few pounds in his pocket, 7 flutes to sell, and an ambition that would reshape New York forever. The voyage took nearly 3 months. Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, Johann met a German passenger who had lived in America and made money trading furs. The man explained how the business worked. You bought pelts from trappers and Native Americans for very little. You sold them in London for enormous profit. By the time the ship reached Baltimore, Johann had decided to abandon the music trade. Furs would be his future. He arrived in New York in 1784 and anglicized his name. Johann Jakob became John Jacob. Within 2 years, he had opened a small shop in Lower Manhattan, buying raw hides and preparing them for export. He worked brutal hours. He learned to grade furs by touch, identifying quality that others missed. He undercut his competitors on price while demanding higher standards. The Jay Treaty of 1794 changed everything. The agreement between Britain and the United States opened new markets in Canada and the Great Lakes region. Astor moved quickly. He established trading posts, made deals with the Northwest Company in Montreal, and built a network that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the frontier. By 1800, he had accumulated $250,000. In today's terms, that figure approaches $500 million. He was not yet 40 years old, but Astor understood something that would define his family for generations. Fur trading was profitable, but unpredictable. Fashion changed. Animal populations declined. The real money, the permanent money, lay in the ground itself. Manhattan. The island was growing. Every year more people arrived. Every year the city pushed further north. Astor began buying land that others considered worthless. Farms, swamps, empty lots far from the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan. He did not build on this property. He waited. As the city expanded, the value of his holdings multiplied. In 1808, he founded the American Fur Company with the blessing of President Thomas Jefferson. The enterprise grew into a monopoly that dominated the trade from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast. Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River bore his name. So did an entire region of the Oregon Territory. The fur business eventually declined, just as Astor had predicted. By the 1830s, he had sold most of his trading interests and concentrated entirely on real estate. He bought more Manhattan property. He built tenements and collected rents. He lent money at interest rates that made him richer while others struggled. When John Jacob Astor died in March of 1848, he was the wealthiest person in the United States. His estate was valued between $20 and $30 million. Historians estimate this represented nearly 1% of the entire American economy. No individual had ever accumulated so much. He left $400,000 to establish a public library in New York. The Astor Library later merged with other institutions to become the New York Public Library. He left $50,000 for a poorhouse in Waldorf, the German village he had fled 65 years earlier. The rest went to his son, William Backhouse Astor, and with that fortune came something more valuable than money. The Astor name now meant old wealth, established wealth, respectable wealth, the kind of wealth that could look down on anyone who came after. Chapter 2. The Ferry Boy from Staten Island. The 16-year-old stood at the edge of New York Harbor, watching the boats cross between Staten Island and Manhattan. He had quit school 5 years earlier. He could barely read, but he understood water, wind, and profit better than most men twice his age. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt. According to family legend, he had borrowed $100 from his mother to buy a small sailing vessel called a periauger. Flat-bottomed and practical, it was not elegant, neither was he. That was 1810. Within 12 months, the teenage ferryman had reportedly repaid his mother and earned $1,000 in profit. Within a decade, he would dominate the waters around New York. Cornelius was born on May 27, 1794, in Port Richmond on Staten Island. His father farmed a small plot and ran a modest boat service hauling cargo to Manhattan. The family descended from Dutch settlers who had arrived in the 1600s, but generations of hard labor had not lifted them from poverty. Young Cornelius saw no future in farming. The water offered something better. The War of 1812 provided his first major opportunity. The federal government needed supplies delivered to forts around New York Harbor. Vanderbilt won contracts, expanded his fleet, and learned to navigate not just currents, but also commerce. By the time peace returned, he had accumulated $10,000 and a small fleet of sailing vessels. Then came steam. In 1817, a businessman named Thomas Gibbons offered Vanderbilt a job captaining a steamboat on the route between New Jersey and New York. The position paid only $1,000 per year, far less than Vanderbilt could earn on his own. But he recognized what steam power meant for the future of transportation. He accepted the job and spent the next 11 years learning everything about the new technology. He also learned how to fight monopolies. The state of New York had granted exclusive steamboat rights to Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston. Anyone else operating steam vessels in New York waters faced legal action. Vanderbilt ran his boat anyway, evading capture, challenging the courts, and undercutting prices until the monopoly collapsed. By 1829, Vanderbilt was ready to work for himself again. He launched competing steamboat lines on the Hudson River and Long Island Sound. His strategy never varied. Enter a market, slash prices below what competitors could sustain. Drive them into bankruptcy or force them to pay him to leave. Then raise prices and collect the profits. It was ruthless. It was legal. It made him extraordinarily rich. By the 1830s, steamboat entrepreneurs commonly received the honorary title of Commodore. By the end of the 1840s, only one man still carried it: Cornelius Vanderbilt. The California gold rush of 1849 opened new possibilities. Thousands of prospectors needed passage from the East Coast to San Francisco. The fastest route ran through Panama, controlled by established shipping companies. Vanderbilt found an alternative. He built a transit route across Nicaragua, cutting travel time and offering lower fares. The venture earned over $1 million annually and cemented his reputation as a man who could outmaneuver anyone. By the 1850s, Vanderbilt had assembled a steamship empire worth tens of millions. He was famous, feared, and completely uninterested in social approval. He swore constantly. He chewed tobacco and spat where he pleased. He conducted business with a bluntness that horrified polite society. This was not a man the old families of New York wished to know. In 1863, at an age when most men retired, Vanderbilt pivoted to railroads. He took control of the New York and Harlem Railroad. The following year, he acquired the Hudson River Railroad. By 1867, he controlled the New York Central. In 1870, he merged these holdings into the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, creating one of the first giant corporations in American history. 3 years later, he added the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway. For the first time, a single railroad system connected New York City to Chicago. Grand Central Depot, completed in 1871, stood as the physical monument to his achievement. Cornelius Vanderbilt died on January 4, 1877, at 82 years old. His fortune exceeded $100 million. Adjusted for the size of the American economy, no individual has matched that concentration of wealth since. He left the bulk of his estate to his son William Henry, believing the others lacked the discipline to preserve it. He had built more wealth than John Jacob Astor. He had transformed American transportation. He had proven that a boy with no education and no connections could rise to dominate an entire nation's economy. But none of it mattered to the people who controlled New York society. To them, Cornelius Vanderbilt remained what he had always been: a ferryman with too much money. Chapter 3: The Gatekeeper and the Outsiders. In Gilded Age New York, money alone meant nothing. You could own railroads stretching from the Atlantic to Chicago. You could build mansions that dwarfed European palaces. None of it mattered if the wrong woman refused to know you. Her name was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Born in 1830, she came from a family that traced its roots to the Dutch settlers who founded New Amsterdam 2 centuries earlier. Her father made his fortune in shipping. Her mother descended from the Van Cortlandts. By the time little Lena arrived, the family was worth $500,000. The Schermerhorns did not merely have money. They had lineage, generations of status that no amount of cash could purchase. In 1853, Caroline married William Backhouse Astor, Jr., grandson of the fur trader who had died as the richest man in America. It was a union of fortunes and pedigrees, but the Astor name still carried the faint odor of commerce. Only 2 generations separated the family from a German immigrant who arrived with 7 flutes in his pocket. Caroline intended to change that. For 2 decades, she raised 5 children while her husband preferred his yachts to social events. After her mother-in-law died in 1872, she began her ascent. Within a decade, she controlled who mattered in New York. Her partner was a short, balding Southerner named Ward McAllister. Born in Savannah to a prominent legal family, McAllister had spent years traveling through Europe, studying the rituals of titled nobility. He returned determined to impose similar standards on the chaotic wealth flooding into New York after the Civil War. He called Caroline the Mystic Rose, a reference to Dante. Together, they built a system elegant in its cruelty. Society operated through calling cards. Before you could attend a ball, the hostess had to acknowledge your existence. Mrs. Astor kept a list. If your name did not appear on it, no door would open. In 1872, McAllister founded the Society of Patriarchs, a committee of 25 gentlemen overseeing the great balls of each season. By the 1880s, he had crystallized his legacy by declaring that only 400 people counted in fashionable New York. The number matched the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The Vanderbilts were not among them. By the 1870s, they possessed more wealth than the Astors had ever accumulated. They controlled railroads, real estate, and financial empires. But in the eyes of old New York, they remained what they had always been: descendants of a Staten Island ferryman, outsiders. William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore, had married a woman determined to change this verdict. Her name was Alva Smith. Born in 1853 in Mobile, Alabama, the daughter of a cotton merchant whose fortune the Civil War destroyed. Young Alva received her education in France, learning European manners and ambition in equal measure. When she returned to New York, she possessed beauty, charm, and no intention of accepting exclusion. In 1875, Alva married William Kissam at Calvary Church. She was 22. She had found her weapon. The Vanderbilt fortune gave Alva resources that old New York could not match. Direct assault would fail. Mrs. Astor simply refused to acknowledge the family existed. No calling card had ever been exchanged. Alva studied her enemy. To defeat the gatekeeper, she would need to build something so magnificent that even the queen of society could not ignore it. She would need a castle. Chapter 4. A Mansion as a Weapon. In 1878, construction began on the corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. Over the next 4 years, a building unlike anything New York had ever seen rose from the ground. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt. He had been the first American admitted to the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had studied the great chateau of the Loire Valley. He understood exactly what Alva Vanderbilt wanted. Not a home, a statement. Hunt designed a French Renaissance palace in gleaming white limestone. The style was known as chateauesque, inspired by the castle architecture of 15th century France. It stood in stark contrast to the somber brownstones that lined the rest of Fifth Avenue. Where neighboring homes whispered respectability, this one shouted ambition. The mansion contained 60 rooms spread across 3 stories. Visitors entered through a grand hall 60 feet long, its walls faced entirely in stone. The library featured French Renaissance paneling imported from Europe. The salon contained furniture that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette. A Gothic banquet room measured 50 feet by 35, dominated by a massive double fireplace with an oak overmantel carved by the Austrian sculptor Karl Bitter. The total cost reached $3 million. In today's terms, that figure approaches $100 million. New Yorkers called it the Petit Chateau. The name was ironic. There was nothing small about it. The mansion occupied the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue, directly across the street from the triple palace that William Kissam's father had built for himself and 2 of his daughters. The Vanderbilts were claiming their territory. An entire stretch of Fifth Avenue now belonged to them. Old money noticed. They could not help but notice. The Petit Chateau was designed to be impossible to ignore. Every architectural choice announced that the Vanderbilts had arrived and intended to stay. But a building alone would not be enough. Mrs. Astor could simply refuse to acknowledge its existence, just as she refused to acknowledge the family who lived inside it. The Petit Chateau was finished, beautiful, and socially irrelevant. Alva needed an event, something that would force even the Queen of New York society to respond, something so spectacular that refusing to attend would be more damaging than attending. She began planning a housewarming party. It would not be an ordinary reception. Alva envisioned a costume ball on a scale that New York had never witnessed. She would invite over 1,000 guests. She would spend whatever it took to make the evening unforgettable. She would create an occasion so magnificent that everyone who mattered would have to acknowledge her. Everyone. The invitations went out in the spring of 1883. The date was set for March 26th. New York society began preparing costumes months in advance. Newspapers reported on the upcoming event with breathless anticipation. One invitation, however, was conspicuously absent. According to the story that circulated through New York drawing rooms, Alva had not sent a card to young Carrie Astor, the popular daughter of Mrs. Astor herself. The omission was deliberate. Carrie had been rehearsing a quadrille with her friends, a dance they planned to perform at the ball. Without an invitation, she could not attend. And Alva knew exactly why no invitation had been sent. Mrs. Astor had never called on her. According to the rules of society, you could not invite someone to your home if they had never formally acknowledged your existence. Mrs. Astor had spent years pretending the Vanderbilts did not exist. Now that silence had consequences. The trap was set. Chapter 5. The Ball That Changed Everything. The morning after Carrie Astor discovered she had not been invited, her mother's carriage appeared on Fifth Avenue. Mrs. Astor had no choice. Her daughter had been practicing a quadrille for weeks. Her friends had all received their invitations. To be excluded would be a humiliation the Astor name could not afford. So, The Queen of New York society did something she had never done before. She sent her footman to the door of the Vanderbilt mansion with her calling card. It was a surrender disguised as a social courtesy. The invitation arrived the following day. On the evening of Monday, March 26, 1883, police officers assembled at the corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. By 8 o'clock, crowds had gathered on the sidewalks. Workers were still putting up the awning over the entrance. The city had never seen anything quite like this. Carriages began arriving at 10. Nearly 1,200 guests stepped onto the red carpet, each wearing costumes that had taken months to prepare. The New York Times had been reporting on the preparations for weeks. Dressmakers and cobblers had studied old books to ensure historical accuracy. Some costumes had been ordered from the House of Worth in Paris. Others were decorated with real sapphires, rubies, and emeralds. The host, William Kissam Vanderbilt, appeared as the Duc de Guise in yellow silk tights and a black velvet cloak embroidered in gold. Alva wore the costume of a Venetian princess inspired by a painting by Cabanel. Her gown shaded from deep orange to pale canary, with a train of blue satin embroidered in gold. On her head sat a jeweled cap featuring a peacock made entirely of colored gems. But the costume everyone remembered belonged to Alice Vanderbilt, wife of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. She came dressed as Electric Light. Her gown of yellow satin was decorated with glass beads in a lightning bolt pattern. In her hand she carried a torch powered by hidden batteries. When she raised it above her head, it glowed like the Statue of Liberty. Thomas Edison had opened the nation's first electric station only the year before. Alice Vanderbilt had turned herself into the future. At exactly 11:30, the dancing began. The guests had assembled in the third-floor gymnasium, which had been transformed into a tropical forest filled with palm trees, orchids, and bougainvillea. One by one, 5 quadrilles descended the grand staircase. The Dresden quadrille wore all white like living porcelain dolls. The Opera Buffet quadrille featured costumes trimmed with demon fringe. The Star quadrille was organized by Mrs. Astor herself. And there she was, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the woman who had refused to acknowledge the Vanderbilts for years, dancing in their home. Her daughter Carrie performed the quadrille she had practiced. Ward McAllister, the arbiter of taste who had helped create the 400, was there too. The chefs of Delmonico's served dinner at 2 in the morning. The menu included terrapin, fried oysters, and salmon. The champagne alone had cost $65,000. Contemporary sources put the total expense at $250,000, nearly $6 million in today's money. $11,000 had gone to flowers. The dancing continued until sunrise. As dawn broke over 5th Avenue, Alva led her guests in one final Virginia reel. Then it was over. Men in powdered wigs stumbled home through the morning light. The newspapers reported every detail. They praised Alva's taste. They marveled at the costumes. They declared it the social event of the generation. There was criticism, too. The New York Sun published an article condemning such excess when so many in the same city were suffering. But the criticism did not matter. What mattered was that, as of March 27, 1883, the Vanderbilts stood at the top of New York society. Mrs. Astor had come to their house. She had danced in their ballroom. She could never pretend they did not exist again. Alva had won. Chapter 6. The Opera War. The Academy of Music had stood at 14th Street and Irving Place since 1854. For nearly 3 decades, it had been the only opera house in New York that mattered. The city's oldest families owned the 18 boxes that lined its interior, and those boxes determined who belonged in society and who did not. The Vanderbilts did not own a box. William Kissam Vanderbilt reportedly offered $30,000 to purchase one. The Academy's directors refused. It did not matter how much money the new families had. There was no room for them. This was the point. The Academy's limited capacity was not a flaw. It was a feature. As Edith Wharton later wrote, the old families cherished the opera house precisely because it was small and inconvenient, and thus kept out the new people. But the new people had something the old families did not fully appreciate. They had patience. They had ambition. And they had enough money to build their own opera house. On April 28, 1880, 22 men gathered at Delmonico's restaurant. They elected officers and established subscriptions for a new company. The founding stockholders included names that would define American industry for generations: Vanderbilt, Morgan, Roosevelt. Each box was assessed at 100 shares of stock, with each share worth $100. When August Belmont, president of the Academy, learned of the project, he panicked. He offered to add 26 new boxes to the existing 18. But the placement of these additional boxes would have been far less prestigious than the originals. The new families declined. They were no longer interested in being accommodated. They intended to dominate. The site they chose was on Broadway between 39th and 40th Streets, in the heart of the city's expanding theater district. The architect was J. Cleveland Cady. The design called for 3 tiers of private boxes where the new industrial families could display their wealth to the world. Construction took 3 years. On the evening of October 22, 1883, the Metropolitan Opera opened its doors. The production was Gounod's Faust. The Swedish soprano Christine Nielsen sang the role of Marguerite. She had been lured away from the Academy at $2,000 per performance. Henry Abbey, the impresario who leased the building, had spared no expense. The performance lasted 5 hours. In the boxes sat the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, the Drexels, the Whitneys, the Goleys. William Henry Vanderbilt, whose fortune exceeded that of any other American, occupied 2 boxes and hosted the Lord Chief Justice of England. The newspapers described the house as bright as a new dollar. Someone noted that the box holders themselves were the real spectacle. The opera was almost incidental. Mrs. Perron Stevens, a social climber famous for hedging her bets, attended both houses that night. For the next 3 years, New York had 2 opera companies competing for audiences. The Academy countered by hiring Adelina Patti, the most famous soprano in the world, at the staggering fee of $5,000 per performance. Both impresarios lost fortunes. Abbey ended his first season nearly $500,000 in debt. But money was not the issue. The issue was prestige. And prestige had shifted. The Metropolitan Opera House had more boxes. It had better sightlines. It had the backing of families whose combined fortunes dwarfed those of the old Knickerbocker aristocracy. Most importantly, it had become the place where society wanted to be seen. By 1886, the Academy of Music canceled its opera season. It never presented opera again. The building survived another 4 decades, hosting vaudeville and other entertainments, before being demolished in 1926. The old families had tried to exclude the Vanderbilts from their boxes. Now the Vanderbilts had boxes of their own, and the old families were fighting for invitations. Carolyn Astor understood what had happened. Within a few years, she purchased a box at the Metropolitan Opera. If she could not defeat the new order, she would join it. On Monday evenings during the opera season, she sat in the Diamond Horseshoe, draped in jewels, receiving visitors during intermission. Her rival sat nearby in Box 4. That rival was Alice Vanderbilt, wife of Cornelius II. The opera war was over. The Vanderbilts had won that battle too. Chapter 7: Marble House and the Newport Revolution. Before the Vanderbilts arrived, Newport was a seaside town where wealthy families escaped the summer heat in wooden cottages. The houses were large and comfortable but deliberately restrained. The established families who gathered there each July and August believed that too much display was vulgar. Old money whispered. It did not shout. Alva Vanderbilt intended to change that. By 1888, she had conquered New York. The Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue had forced Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her. The opera war had established the Vanderbilts among the city's cultural elite. But summer remained the province of the old families, and Newport was their stronghold. That year, the Goleys threw down a challenge. Ogden Goley, whose family ranked second only to the Astors among New York landlords, hired Richard Morris Hunt to design a mansion that would surpass the Vanderbilts' Petit Chateau. His wife, Mary Wilson Golay made no secret of her ambitions. The new house would be called Ochre Court, and it would be the grandest residence Newport had ever seen. Alva's response was swift. Within months, she hired Hunt herself and commissioned a summer cottage of her own. It would not merely match Ochre Court, it would obliterate it. The site she chose was a parcel on Bellevue Avenue, the fashionable thoroughfare where Newport society paraded each afternoon. Construction began in 1888. Alva insisted on absolute secrecy. Fences surrounded the property. According to one widely repeated story, she brought in workers who spoke no English so they could not gossip about the project in local taverns. For 4 years, Hunt and his craftsmen labored. The mansion that emerged in 1892 was unlike anything America had seen. They called it Marble House, and the name was no exaggeration. 500,000 cubic feet of marble covered the exterior and interior. The stone came from 3 continents: white marble from America, yellow Sienna marble from Italy, pink Numidian marble from Algeria. The total cost reached $11 million, of which $7 million went to marble alone. In today's currency, that figure approaches $400 million. The design drew inspiration from the Petit Trianon at Versailles, the intimate palace where Marie Antoinette had retreated from the formalities of court. But there was nothing intimate about Marble House. 50 rooms spread across 4 floors. A staff of 36 servants was required to maintain it. Visitors entered through bronze doors weighing 3,000 pounds apiece. Inside, a grand staircase of yellow Sienna marble swept upward beneath a ceiling painted with gods and goddesses. The wrought iron and gilt bronze railing alone cost more than most houses. The grand salon announced the Vanderbilts' arrival among American royalty. Every surface was covered in 22-karat gold leaf. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across mirrored walls. This was the room where Alva would host the most exclusive gatherings of the Newport season, and she designed it to stun. The dining room offered a different kind of extravagance. Walls of pink Numidian marble surrounded a massive table set with chairs modeled after those in the court of Louis XIV. Each chair was cast in bronze and gilded with gold. They weighed 75 pounds apiece. The armchairs at either end weighed 100 pounds. Guests could not seat themselves. A footman was required to slide each chair into place. The message was unmistakable. The Vanderbilts were not merely rich, they lived like kings. William Kissam Vanderbilt presented the deed to the completed mansion as a birthday gift to his wife on her 39th birthday. The gesture was generous, but it also proved shrewd. When the marriage ended 3 years later, Alva already owned Marble House outright. The Golays finished Ochre Court the same year, 1892. Their chateau was impressive, with 50 rooms and a 3-story great hall that rivaled the finest houses in France. At $4.5 million, it was among the most expensive homes ever built in Newport. But Marble House cost more than twice as much, and everyone knew it. The summer of 1892 marked the beginning of a new era. The wooden cottages that had defined Newport for decades suddenly looked modest, almost quaint. Families who had spent summers in comfortable shingled houses now faced a choice: build something grander or accept diminished status. One by one, they chose to build. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, William's older brother, had purchased a wooden mansion called the Breakers several years earlier. After seeing what his younger brother and sister-in-law had accomplished, he began planning something far more ambitious. When the original Breakers burned in 1892, he seized the opportunity to start fresh. The race was on. Newport's transformation from summer colony to monument of American wealth had begun. And at the center of it all stood Alva Vanderbilt, in her marble palace on Bellevue Avenue, having once again bent society to her will. Chapter 8. The Breakers, When Brothers Competed. On the night of November 25th, 1892, fire swept through a wooden mansion on Ochre Point in Newport. By morning, nothing remained but ashes and 2 fire-damaged safes containing Alice Vanderbilt's jewelry. The house had been called the Breakers, named for the waves that crashed against the cliffs below. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, had purchased it 7 years earlier from tobacco heir Pierre Lorillard for nearly $500,000. He had spent another $500,000 improving it. Now it was gone. For most families, such a loss would have been devastating. For Cornelius Vanderbilt, it was an opportunity. That same year, his younger brother William Kissam had completed Marble House on Bellevue Avenue. The $11 million palace had transformed Newport and established William and Alva as the undisputed leaders of summer society. Cornelius was the senior member of the Vanderbilt family, the chairman of the New York Central Railroad, the man who had inherited the bulk of their father's fortune. Yet his brother's summer cottage had surpassed anything he owned. The fire changed that calculation. Within 6 weeks, Cornelius had hired Richard Morris Hunt to design a replacement. The architect had just finished Marble House. Now the elder brother wanted something grander. Hunt initially proposed a modest 2-story villa in fireproof limestone. Cornelius rejected it. He wanted a palace. The design that emerged drew inspiration from the 16th century palazzos of Genoa and Turin. Hunt studied the architectural treatises of the Italian Renaissance, particularly the work of Rubens documenting the great houses of northern Italy. The result would be his masterpiece. Construction began in the spring of 1893. Cornelius demanded speed. 2,000 workers labored in shifts around the clock, day and night, to complete the structure in just 2 years. Marble House had taken 4 years to build. The breakers would take half that time. The mansion that rose on Ochre Point dwarfed everything else in Newport. 70 rooms spread across 5 floors. The footprint covered nearly an acre. The great hall measured 50 feet in every direction, a perfect cube of limestone and marble rising to a ceiling painted with classical figures. Over each of its 6 doors, sculptural groups celebrated human achievement. One depicted Richard Morris Hunt himself, immortalized alongside Galileo, Dante, and Apollo. The fireproofing that Cornelius demanded shaped every decision. The structure used steel trusses throughout. No wooden framing appeared anywhere in the building. The exterior was faced in Indiana limestone over brick. Most remarkably, the boilers were located in a separate underground facility beneath the front lawn, connected to the house by a tunnel. Cornelius would never lose another home to fire. The interior brought together craftsmen from across the world. Jules Allard and Sons of Paris designed the formal rooms. Karl Bitter, the Austrian sculptor who had worked on Marble House, created relief panels. The library featured 16th century paneling from a French chateau and walls of Circassian walnut stamped with gold leaf. The dining room ceiling took inspiration from a Roman villa, with painted dolphins symbolizing hospitality in the sea. The cost reached $7 million. This was less than Marble House, but only because William had spent $7 million on marble alone. In every other respect, the breakers exceeded its rival. It was larger, it was grander, it was built faster, and it belonged to the senior brother. Richard Morris Hunt did not live to see his creation fully appreciated. He died in Newport during the summer of 1895, supervising the finishing touches on what would be his final commission. He was 67 years old. The mansion he left behind would define American architecture for generations. Cornelius enjoyed only one summer at the breakers in good health. In July of 1896, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. The workaholic who had never seemed happy, who had taken his position so seriously that friends rarely saw him smile, was forced to retire from active business. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage on September 12, 1899. He was 55 years old. His widow Alice remained. She had overseen the household operations at the breakers and influenced much of its design. Now she presided over it alone, hosting Monday evening receptions during the Newport season, receiving visitors in the music room where her daughter Gertrude had been married. Alice outlived her husband by 35 years. She outlived 4 of her 7 children. Her eldest daughter died in childhood. Her eldest son William died of typhoid while attending Yale. Her son Alfred went down with the Lusitania. Her son Reginald drank himself to death. Only Gertrude, who had found the Whitney Museum of American Art, and Gladys, who inherited the breakers, survived her. When Alice died in 1934, the era she represented had already vanished. The income taxes and stock market crashes that followed the Great War had made such houses impossible to maintain. The breakers passed to Gladys, who in 1948 leased it to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year. Today it stands as the largest and most visited of the Newport mansions. 400,000 people walk through its rooms each year. They marvel at the Great Hall, the gilded music room, the dining room with its bronze chandeliers. They learn about the Vanderbilts and the world they built. What they cannot see is the rivalry that created it. Two brothers, two architects' commissions, two visions of what it meant to be a Vanderbilt. William had built Marble House to prove the family belonged in society. Cornelius built the breakers to prove he still led it. Chapter 9. The Waldorf Revenge. In the early 1890s, two women in New York both claimed the same title. One was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the gatekeeper who had dominated high society for 2 decades. The other was Mary Dahlgren Paul Astor, wife of William Waldorf Astor, Caroline's nephew by marriage. The dispute centered on something that might seem trivial, a name on a card. But in Gilded Age New York, names meant everything. William Waldorf believed his wife deserved to be known simply as Mrs. Astor. His father, John Jacob Astor III, had been the elder brother of Caroline's husband. That made William the head of the senior branch of the Astor family. In his view, his aunt should add her husband's name to distinguish herself. Caroline ignored him. She had spent 20 years building her position. She would not share her title with anyone. William Waldorf decided to make her pay. The Astor family owned adjacent mansions on Fifth Avenue in the lower 30s. Caroline lived at 350 on the southwest corner of 34th Street. William Waldorf had inherited his father's house next door, at the corner of 33rd Street. The two brownstones shared a wall. The families had once been close enough to connect their homes with interior passages. Now William Waldorf announced his intentions. He would demolish his father's mansion. In its place, he would build a hotel. Not just any hotel. A 13-story tower that would loom over his aunt's home, block her light, fill her quiet neighborhood with strangers, and make her life unbearable. He named it after the German village where the Astor fortune had begun. The Waldorf Hotel opened on March 13, 1893. Designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg in the German Renaissance style, it rose 225 feet above Fifth Avenue. 15 public rooms and 450 guest rooms filled its interior. George Bolt, a hotelier from Philadelphia, managed the operation with a staff that catered to the city's wealthiest visitors. William Waldorf did not stay to watch his aunt suffer. He had already left for England, where he would eventually renounce his American citizenship and accept a British peerage. But he could imagine her reaction from across the Atlantic. The construction noise, the crowds on the sidewalk, the commercial bustle that replaced the residential quiet she had cultivated for decades. Caroline reportedly called it a glorified tavern. But she understood what her nephew had done. He had turned her own neighborhood against her. For 3 years she endured it, then she capitulated. In 1896, Caroline Astor moved uptown. Her new residence, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, occupied the northeast corner of Fifth Avenue and 65th Street. It was a double mansion in the French Renaissance style, with one half for Caroline and one half for her son, John Jacob Astor IV. The ballroom could accommodate 1,200 guests, 3 times the capacity of her old home. The new mansion faced Central Park. The neighborhood was quieter, more fashionable, further from the commercial development creeping up from below. Caroline had retreated, but she had retreated in style. Her son saw an opportunity. John Jacob Astor IV was now the head of the American branch of the family. His cousin had fled to England. His mother had abandoned her old home. The site at 34th Street sat empty, waiting for someone to decide its fate. He chose to build another hotel. The Astoria opened in 1897, directly adjacent to the Waldorf. Hardenberg designed this one too, making it taller and grander than its neighbor. 16 stories rose 270 feet above the street. 550 guest rooms and 25 public rooms filled the interior. The style matched the Waldorf, but exceeded it in every dimension. The two hotels stood side by side, built by feuding relatives competing for the same guests. It was an absurd arrangement, but the Astors had always understood real estate better than family harmony. Someone proposed a merger. The hotels would be connected by a 300-foot marble corridor. Guests could walk from one to the other, passing restaurants and shops along the way. The fashionable set called it Peacock Alley, because the wealthy strutted through it displaying their finery. The combined establishment became the Waldorf Astoria. The hyphen in the name represented the corridor that joined them. With 1,300 guest rooms and 40 public spaces, it was the largest hotel in the world. The total cost of both buildings, excluding furnishings, reached $15 million. Oscar Cherky, the maitre d'hotel who had come from Delmonico's, presided over the dining rooms. He invented dishes that would outlast the building itself: Waldorf salad, eggs Benedict, Thousand Island dressing. The hotel became the living room of New York society, a place where the old families and the new could mingle in public splendor. Caroline Astor never returned to 34th Street. She remained in her mansion on 65th Street, hosting her annual balls, receiving visitors, maintaining the rituals she had established decades earlier. Her health declined in her final years. By the time she died in October of 1908, her mind had retreated into the past. According to those who attended her in those final months, she would dress in her finest gowns, descend her marble staircase, and receive guests who existed only in her memory. Her son survived her by less than 4 years. In April of 1912, John Jacob Astor IV boarded the Titanic with his young second wife. He did not survive the sinking. The Waldorf Astoria outlasted them both, but not by much. By the 1920s, the neighborhood had changed. The residential elegance that Caroline had fled was long gone. Hotels and department stores dominated the avenue. The Waldorf Astoria, once the most modern establishment in the city, now seemed dated. In 1929, the buildings were sold and demolished. In their place rose the Empire State Building, which for decades would be the tallest structure in the world. The name survived. A new Waldorf Astoria opened on Park Avenue in 1931, carrying forward the legacy of the feuding cousins. But the original site, where Caroline Astor had once presided over society from her brownstone parlor, now belonged to something even grander than she could have imagined. William Waldorf Astor had wanted to loom over his aunt. In the end, everything was eclipsed. Chapter 10. The End of an Era. The world that made the Vanderbilts and Astors possible was ending, though few of them realized it at the time. In February of 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. For the first time in American history, the federal government could tax income. The initial rates were modest, only 1% on earnings above $3,000, rising to 7% on incomes over $500,000. Less than 1% of Americans owed anything at all. But the principle had been established. The great fortunes that had accumulated untaxed for generations would now be subject to redistribution. The wealthy grumbled but adapted. John D. Rockefeller had once declared that the people had no right to share in the earnings of a man who had accumulated money within the law. Now the law had changed. Within 5 years, wartime rates would push the top bracket to 77%. The era of limitless accumulation was over. The Great War accelerated everything. When fighting broke out in Europe in August of 1914, most Americans assumed it would be a distant conflict that would resolve itself within months. They were wrong. The war would consume 10 million lives and redraw the map of Europe. It would also claim members of both families whose rivalry had defined New York society for a generation. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt boarded the Lusitania on May 1, 1915. He was 37 years old, the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and one of the wealthiest men in America. His father had disinherited his older brother Cornelius III for marrying against family wishes, leaving Alfred as the principal heir. He had received over $70 million at the age of 22. Alfred was traveling to England for a meeting of the International Horse Breeders Association. He had received warnings before departure. The German government had placed notices in American newspapers declaring the waters around Britain to be a war zone. An anonymous telegram urged him not to sail. He dismissed it as a prank. On May 7th, a German submarine fired a torpedo into the ship's hull off the coast of Ireland. The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. Alfred could not swim. Witnesses reported that he spent his final moments helping women and children into lifeboats, distributing life jackets to passengers who needed them more than he did. When a young mother holding an infant had no way to secure herself, he gave her his own life vest and fastened it around her. Then the ship went down. His body was never recovered. The New York Times reported that people would remember him not as a millionaire sportsman, but as the children's hero. His family, however, asked that the Lusitania not be mentioned in funeral announcements or his obituary. The ship that killed him was to remain nameless. The sinking helped turn American public opinion against Germany. 2 years later, the United States entered the war. By then, both Caroline Astor and her son John Jacob IV were already gone, their deaths chronicled in the previous decade's headlines. The war changed the world the great families had known. European aristocracy, once the model and aspiration for American society, lay shattered. The Kaiser fled to exile in the Netherlands. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved. The Romanovs were executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who had once forced her way into Caroline Astor's ballroom, now devoted her fortune to a different cause entirely. After her divorce from William K. Vanderbilt in 1895, Alva had remarried Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. When he died in 1908, she found a new purpose. She joined the suffrage movement, inspired by the militant tactics of Emmeline Pankhurst's activists in England. She funded organizations, hosted conferences at Marble House, and put her name and money behind the campaign for women's right to vote. In 1916, she helped found the National Woman's Party alongside Alice Paul. The following January, they organized the first protest ever held in front of the White House. Alva became the organization's president and its most important financial supporter. In August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women could vote. By then, her former husband was dead. William K. Vanderbilt had passed away in Paris on July 22, 1920, at the age of 70. His estate was valued at over $50 million. Federal estate taxes claimed more than $11 million. The woman who had built Marble House and broken into Mrs. Astor's world spent her final years in France, near her daughter Consuelo. The daughter she had forced into marriage with a duke. The daughter who had eventually forgiven her. Mother and daughter had reconciled over their shared commitment to women's rights, and Consuelo had spoken at suffrage gatherings that Alva organized. Alva suffered a stroke in 1932 that left her partially paralyzed. She died in Paris on January 26, 1933. Her funeral at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York featured all-female pallbearers. Her casket was flanked by members of the National Woman's Party. She left $100,000 to the organization in her will. She had begun her public life as a society woman determined to storm the gates of old money. She ended it as an activist determined to tear down the barriers that excluded half the population from political life. The ballrooms she had stormed were empty now. The mansions she had built were being sold or demolished. The society she had infiltrated no longer existed in any recognizable form. Her children inherited what remained, but the fortune was smaller than it had once been. The taxes were higher. The world was different. And the houses, those magnificent houses that had announced to New York and Newport and the world that the Vanderbilts had arrived, were becoming too expensive to maintain. Chapter 11. The Mansions That Vanished. They came down faster than they had gone up. In 1926, the wrecking balls arrived on Fifth Avenue. One by one, the great houses that had defined New York society for a generation were reduced to rubble. The limestone and marble that had taken years to quarry and carve was hauled away in weeks. The ballrooms where the 400 had danced became empty lots, then construction sites, then department stores. The Petit Chateau went first. The house that Alva Vanderbilt had built to announce her family's arrival, the house where she had hosted the ball that conquered Mrs. Astor, was sold to a real estate developer named Benjamin Winter. He paid for the land, not the building. The mansion that had cost $3 million to construct in 1882 was demolished in the spring of 1926. In its place rose a 20-story commercial building. Today, a clothing store occupies the ground floor. Alva, by then Mrs. Belmont, noted the demolition in passing in a draft of her memoirs. She did not linger on the subject. She had moved on to other battles. The same year, the largest private residence ever built in New York City met the same fate. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, which stretched an entire block along Fifth Avenue from 57th to 58th Street, was sold to the Brasted Realty Corporation for $7 million. The price reflected the value of the land, not the 130 rooms that stood on it. Alice Vanderbilt, the widow of Cornelius, had lived alone in the house for nearly 3 decades. Her husband had died in 1899. Her children had scattered to their own homes and their own lives. The mansion required more than 30 servants just to maintain, and the income from her trust fund barely covered the costs. Commercial development had surrounded her on all sides. Hotels and office buildings loomed over the chateau that had once commanded the avenue. She resisted as long as she could. Then she capitulated. A week before the wreckers arrived, Alice opened the house to the public. For 50 cents, anyone could walk through the rooms where the Vanderbilts had entertained presidents and princes. Thousands came. They wanted to see how the highest of high society had lived during an era that was already fading into memory. Then the walls came down. In 1928, the Bergdorf Goodman department store opened on the site. Shoppers now browse where the Vanderbilts once dined. But Alice saved what she could. The wrought iron gates that had guarded the entrance were donated to Central Park, where they still stand at the conservatory garden. The carved fireplace from the Great Hall went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sculptural reliefs from the facade ended up in the lobby of the Sherry Netherland Hotel. The mansion was gone, but fragments of it survived, scattered across the city like relics of a vanished civilization. The Astors lost their palace, too. The double mansion at 65th Street, where Caroline had spent her final years receiving phantom guests, was sold and demolished in 1926. The contents were auctioned off first. Paintings, furniture, decorative ceilings, architectural elements, everything had a price. In its place rose Temple Emmanuel, one of the largest synagogues in the world. The old order was being erased. The great families had built monuments to their wealth along Fifth Avenue, and now those monuments were being replaced by monuments to commerce. Bergdorf Goodman. Saks Fifth Avenue. Tiffany's. The names on the buildings changed, but the purpose remained the same. This was where New York came to spend money. The reasons were practical. Maintaining a mansion required an army of servants, and servants had become expensive. Heating the cavernous rooms consumed mountains of coal. The property taxes climbed every year. And the land beneath these houses had become worth more than the houses themselves. A developer could demolish a mansion and build a commercial tower that generated income for decades. The math was simple. The federal estate tax made the calculations even clearer. When a patriarch died, his heirs faced bills that could consume a quarter of the fortune. The only way to pay was to sell assets. And the mansions, which produced no income and cost fortunes to maintain, were the obvious choice. The houses that had taken decades to design and build were liquidated in months. By the end of the 1920s, Millionaire's Row had become a memory. The brownstones and chateaus that had lined Fifth Avenue from the 30s to the 50s were almost entirely gone. A few survivors remained further north, where the march of commerce had not yet reached. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Some of the Newport cottages fared better. The Breakers still stands on Bellevue Avenue, its 70 rooms preserved exactly as Alice Vanderbilt left them. Her daughter Gladys eventually leased it to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 a year. Today, 400,000 visitors walk through the Great Hall each summer, marveling at the opulence of an age when one family could spend $7 million on a vacation home. Marble House survives too, the birthday gift that William K. Vanderbilt gave to Alva in 1892. The ballroom where she plotted the suffrage movement's campaigns is open to tourists. The dining room chairs still weigh 75 pounds each. And in the mountains of North Carolina, the largest private home in America remains in the Vanderbilt family. Biltmore, built by George Washington. Vanderbilt II in the 1890s, encompasses 250 rooms on 8,000 acres. It was too remote and too large to demolish. Instead, his descendants opened it to the public in 1930, charging admission to help pay the bills. It remains a private residence and a tourist attraction, a monument to what the Vanderbilt fortune could build when applied to a single property in a single location. These are the survivors. They exist because someone decided to preserve them, to transform private homes into public museums. The alternative was demolition. There was no middle ground. The Fifth Avenue mansions did not survive because no one fought for them. They were private property, and their owners chose to sell. The wrecking crews arrived with legal authority and economic justification. The houses came down and the city moved on. What replaced them was taller, denser, more profitable. The skyline that defines modern Manhattan rose from the rubble of the Gilded Age. The Empire State Building stands where the Astors once feuded. Department stores occupy the land where the Vanderbilts once competed for supremacy. The grandchildren of the men who built railroads now shop at Bergdorf Goodman, perhaps unaware that their great-great-grandfather's dining room once occupied the same ground. The mansions vanished because the world that built them vanished. The fortunes remained, but they were taxed. The families remained, but they scattered. The society that had gathered in those ballrooms dispersed into 1,000 different pursuits. No one needed a house with 130 rooms anymore. No one wanted to pay for 30 servants. The era of conspicuous construction had ended. What remained was the memory, and the photographs, and the fragments in museums, and the summer cottages in Newport, preserved behind velvet ropes where tourists pay admission to glimpse how the other half once lived. What remains? The war is over. The combatants are gone. Caroline Astor died believing she still ruled a society that had already moved on without her. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died fighting for causes that would have horrified the world she had once conquered. The fortunes they married into were taxed and divided and dispersed across generations until the name Vanderbilt no longer automatically meant wealth. The social hierarchy that Caroline had policed so carefully collapsed under the weight of immigration and war and economic transformation. The 400 became a quaint historical footnote. But something remains. The summer cottages at Newport stand largely as their owners left them, preserved not as ruins, but as functioning museums. Tour guides lead visitors through rooms designed to intimidate, explaining the cost of the marble, the weight of the chandeliers, the number of servants required to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance. The houses that once announced to the world that their owners had arrived now announce that an entire way of life has departed. In New York, the great mansions are gone, but fragments survive, scattered across the city, embedded in institutions that serve the public. The private became public. The exclusive became accessible. The monuments to individual wealth became monuments to collective memory. The Gilded Age was not a golden age. The name itself was meant as criticism, coined by Mark Twain to describe an era that glittered on the surface but concealed corruption and exploitation beneath. The mansions were built by workers who would never set foot inside them except as servants. The fortunes were accumulated through practices that would later be outlawed. The society that gathered in those ballrooms excluded almost everyone in America on the basis of birth, religion, or the wrong kind of money. And yet the houses were beautiful. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The ambition, however misdirected, produced structures that still inspire awe. We can condemn the inequality and still admire the architecture. We can learn from the past without wanting to return to it. What remains is the story. Two families, one old and one new, fighting for position in a world they helped create. The houses they built as weapons in that war. The balls and operas and snubs they delivered and endured. The way they lived, the way they died, the way they are remembered. It is a story about wealth, but not only about wealth. It is a story about belonging. About the human need to be recognized, to be accepted, to matter. Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt were both, in their different ways, trying to answer the same question. Who counts? Who belongs? Who gets to decide? They answered that question for their era. Their answers no longer apply. But the question endures, and each generation must answer it again. The gates are open now. Anyone can walk through.